we're creating about as many jobs as those other metros combined.
So Bend hates to be compared to Boulder.
We could have a whole hour conversation about this. I think it sets us up another kind of foundation.
Participating. I think that's the difference between being a citizen or sitting on the sidelines.
These conversations are brought to you by the Lad Group, Bend's leading real estate team. Help continue this BendBeat conversation by subscribing, sharing, and leaving us a review. I'm joined here by Lynne McConnell. You're the housing director for the city of Bend.
Correct.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we've got to know each other over the last couple of years. You've assisted in some of the conversations that we've had about housing affordability, housing types, what's happening with the city. And actually in our conversation before we started, you said it's important to be part of a lot of different conversations because not everyone's at city council meetings.
Yes.
So I appreciate you using this as a forum to help disseminate what's going on over in the city and how people can get involved.
Thanks so much. I really do believe that it's important to get out into the community as often as I can and meet with folks so that people who aren't able to spend all that time watching us in action can still find out what's going on. So thank you.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about you previously, both personally and professionally. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your origin story, how and when you arrived in Central Oregon, and some of your previous roles. I know you were involved with Neighborhood Impact for a long time, but I'd love to hear just kind of why you're here and what led you to being in the role you are with the city.
Yeah. So I grew up in that place down south that we don't refer to by name, but came up to University of Oregon as soon as I turned 18 and had free will. So I've been an Oregonian most of my adult life, and have been visiting Central Oregon since I was a little kid. And so I've been seeing it when, the Bend sign as you're coming past Butler Market up onto 3rd Street.
The juniper bushes?
Yeah, that was the edge of town,
the
right?
trimmed juniper bushes, the Bend sign. And not everyone knows that anymore.
Exactly. And I remember that movie theater coming in and thinking, why are they building the movie theater on the edge of town? This is crazy. Nobody's going to go there. So that's my history of Bend, is knowing it when we were still 15,000 people. Yeah. I've been a full-time resident of Bend for just over a decade, but certainly have been growing and visiting over many years.
So you've seen its evolution, whatnot.
Have seen the evolution. I think, also sort of my interest in housing has come partly from coming from a very exclusive part of the country where folks didn't have the opportunity. And I, as an 18-year-old, even knew that I would not be able to move back.
You were already on the outside of housing.
Would never be able to move back to my hometown. And that is important to me in living in Bend, that I am doing what I can to not repeat the mistakes that, my parents and others made in creating exclusive environments that our children can't come back to.
To keep the door open. And I think we've gone through different cycles in Bend. When I talk with a lot of the people that were here for generations, they said that, through the times of the 70s and 80s and, the 60s, when the sawmills were shutting and the economy was struggling, people would leave town for education, opportunity, et cetera, and they weren't coming back, and it wasn't because of housing affordability, it was there's no jobs. And then it got to the point where we kind of had a sweet spot where we had job growth, we had housing affordability, and now we're maybe further on the spectrum of we have jobs, but we no longer have affordability, where people whose kids want to move back, we're starting to shut that door, right?
Exactly.
We just crossed median price of about $800,000 for housing here in Bend, and we're dealing with some pretty big issues regarding housing.
Exactly. It's the kids and it's also the seniors, thinking about seniors on fixed incomes who, if they're here, they can't move, right? If they want to stay in the community, that's the home that they can be in. And even with equity, are unable to sort of adjust a little. And so I, as one of the sandwich generation with aging parents and a little kid, really thinking about how do I keep my family together? How do we move forward? And, could my parents move up here? I don't know. And so all of those things are so important in how we create and build the fabric of this community. In addition to the workforce sector, really thinking about those complete families and how we can all move forward together.
Okay, before we get too into policy, and let's learn a little bit more about you. I read Outward Bound Guide. Tell me about that.
So, I graduated from U of O and really needed to do something different. I knew that I didn't want to look at a computer screen all day. And so I had University of Oregon has a really great outdoor program. And so
Okay.
I think my senior year, I spent 2 weekends in Eugene. It wasn't the place I wanted to be. I was over here a lot outdoors. And so I was able to, straight out of graduation, work for an outward bound program that took kids who were adjudicated into the woods instead of jail, which was a wild ride. I'll just say, really great experience. And then moved on to working with folks, who didn't have that same problem, of all ages, helped them establish some course area in South America, and really was all around the country doing trips of various types. So it was a really fun experience, and then made the fascinating decision to go to law school after that. So pretty big shift, but I think,
some of those times in the woods send you in directions that you don't think, you don't see coming.
Yeah, and it was a great education. Don't regret it a bit. And it also changed how I look at the world. I never wanted to practice sort of full-time long range, but it gave me great education and ability to really look at the world a little differently. And went from there, met my now husband on vacation in Alaska. And he is what I call a recovering bush pilot. And so it took a lot to get him to move away from a little airplane and down to Central Oregon. And we sort of recreated ourselves here after the recession. We're lucky enough to get in 2013 and own our home here. So a little bit of everything, but certainly that love for the outdoors has influenced how I look at my job now, and great perspective, right? And even in law school, I would say to people, my thing was like, nobody's going to die today. We're all okay. Let's just take our exam and go, right? And so I think having that perspective is really good in terms of what our priorities are.
Yeah, so an authentic love for the outdoors, the nature that we live in, with the background in law and policy, has brought you to being the housing director for the city of Bend. What's your personal motivation to focus on housing? Obviously we have, the big thing is everyone talks about lack of housing or the growth of housing ruining our environment, or the high barrier to entry. What has brought your personal motivations to this role, to where you stand right now?
Housing to me is the base of how any of us can succeed or not succeed in the world. If we don't have stability, it's really hard for us to have good health outcomes. If we don't plan well, our environment may be sacrificed. All of the things that come back in my nonprofit and legal career came back to housing stability, housing growth, the equity that we receive if we're able to buy a house, and what that allows us to do in life, both with workforce outcomes and job security, as well as sort of the type of community that we want to live in. We know that folks who are here long term are more invested in the community and give back through things like volunteering, even by picking up your neighbor's packages, if they're out of town, or taking their garbage cans out. And that's really important, I think, to creating the type of community that I want to live in, where we are supporting one another and sort of connected in that way. So housing, I've seen, I grew up in a community where the streets were one way. And from the lowest income area, you couldn't come into the higher income area. And that has influenced me very deeply, even in my lifetime, that this was happening. And I like to think of myself as a little bit younger than maybe I am. But that this type of segregation happened through housing was the baseline of so many structural issues that I think that we are still addressing in this country today. And seeing how working for Neighbor Impact, it was really hard to help people get to stability if they didn't have good housing. I've also seen the other side where friends of mine kind of won the housing lottery, chose to live in a place where they were able to gain a lot of equity, and it gave them phenomenal options for what they could do, both with their jobs and families going forward.
Yeah, so housing above all.
Yeah.
It all starts with housing, as far as our life, and how, I guess, that built environment, how many elements of our life it affects. So I'm not sure exactly where to start, but let's first talk about, the big thing on everyone's mind. A couple years ago, it was more growth-based, and now it's affordability-based. The conversation has become a little bit different. It's like, hey, stop the growth, and now it's like, hey, I can't afford to live here. And so, those are kind of two of the main elements that I hear regarding housing. But let's tackle one at a time. When someone comes and they're newer to Bend, and let's say they won the lottery in California or whatnot of being able to sell their house there, come in here, buy a house cash, and they say growth needs to stop. Bend's perfect. Anything from here out is a negative impact on what it is. How would you respond to that conversation?
Yeah, great question. You know, almost all of us moved here because we love this place
Yep.
and we want it to exist. And I understand that hugely. I loved
Yep.
it when it was 25,000
Yep,
people
sure.
way
Yeah,
back
yeah.
when. At the same time, the state of Oregon does not allow us to stop growth. We must, under state guidelines, plan for what is expected in the next 20 years
Yeah.
and accommodate that growth through all sorts of different policy tools, including expanding our urban growth boundary is one of those many options.
Yep.
And so, you know, recognizing that you love it now, I think the goal